So what we're going to do next is another activity to do really a very close reading of the anchor standards. So we've done with the list, group, and label, we've started to kind of look at the anchor standards, but this is a way to really dig into the document and to read it very closely and talk about what we're thinking as we look at the document. So this strategy is called a Think Aloud, and there are two different Think Alouds you can use with students. The first is a free response Think Aloud, and that's something that you can use for self-assessment, to trace growth, or as a discussion starter, which is what we're going to use it for right now. So we're just going to start discussion about the anchor standards. So just an open free response Think Aloud. You can also do what's called a cued response Think Aloud when you have a particular text type or a strategy you want students to read for, and you can do a cued Think Aloud for that. But in this case, we're just looking for kind of your free responses to this document so we can begin talking about the anchor standards. So what we'll do is we'll be looking at the anchor standards as reading, writing, speaking, listening, and then language or the standards for mathematical practice. And just kind of openly talking about what we're thinking or feeling or noticing or wondering about as we're reading those standards. And the process for a Think Aloud should always follow the pattern of I do, you watch, we do together, and then you do together, and then you do on your own. So it's a great thing to use with students when you're reading a complex text, particularly an informational text, to kind of model the process and work through it together. So for today, what I'll do is model for the reading anchor standards, and then we'll do the writing anchor standards together, and then you'll be doing the others in small groups. So I'm going to just start by looking at the first page of the anchor standards here, and I note the first thing I note is that these are the college and career readiness anchor standards for reading in English language arts, history, social studies, and technical subjects. So first I'm thinking, okay, this is interesting that these anchor standards are the same for all the different disciplines. So that's the first thing that I'm noting. And then I just want to look at the overall kind of organization of the anchor standards, and I just note that they're subdivided into 4 categories, and that each of the first 3 categories has 3 standards, and then the last one only has 1. So I'm going to start by looking at the first reading category, which is key ideas and details. And the first standard says, read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. So the first thing I note there is just the word closely, that this is saying, asking students to read closely. And I know that that's something I think about a lot as a teacher, and how to help students read closely and what it actually means to read closely rather than to just kind of read superficially. So I think that that's an interesting word. I also think I'm kind of drawn to the word inferences. So it says what the text says explicitly, but also to make logical inferences. And I know that that's something that's really complex for students to do, but there's an acknowledgement here that you first have to read for what the text says before you can look at what's suggested beyond the text. And then I'm really interested in citing specific textual evidence, because I know that that's something kind of starts getting me thinking about arguments and making sure that you back up what you say with specific textual evidence. And then finally, I'm really drawn to the word speaking. So, these are the reading standards, but it says to use specific textual evidence when writing or speaking. So kind of drawing from the text there, dictating something about the organization of a classroom that involves speaking and not just writing. Number 2, determine central ideas or themes of a text and analyze their development. Summarize the key supporting details and ideas. So one thing that I think is really notable there is the use of central ideas and themes, because theme is a very language arts type of word, but central ideas is something that I think could be applied to the other disciplines pretty easily. So there I see a clear acknowledgement of these being anchor standards for all disciplines, not just language arts. And then I'm interested in having them summarize the key supporting details and ideas, because I know that writing summaries is a difficult thing for students to do, that they need a lot of guidance in that, and also understanding what key supporting details actually are and pulling those out. So it's kind of a complex thing. And then the third one is to analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. So right away my brain is kind of going to that analyze word, and I know that that's really complex, higher level thinking. And now I'm kind of thinking back to the Idaho standards, which I know had a lot of identify, identify, identify. And here I see some different, making inferences, determining central ideas, analyzing, so some definite higher level thinking here. And then I really like how specific this standard is. So that it says we're analyzing how and why, very specific what the task is, and then the what that we're going to analyze, individuals, events, and ideas. So for me as a teacher, it's really clear what exactly it is that my students are going to be analyzing and how I could support them in doing that. And then finally, I really like the fact that it says how the ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. So it acknowledges that these things are kind of moving and changing and developing, not always the same in any given text. Okay, so now that I have modeled all 10 of the reading anchor standards for you, we're going to move to the next step in the Think Aloud process, which is we do together for the writing standards. So what I'll do is go through these by category, and I'll read all 3 of the standards under one category and then ask you to jump in with what you're thinking or noticing or feeling as you look at those standards. So our first category is text types and purposes, and we have 3 standards there. Write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or texts using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. Number 2, write informative explanatory text to determine and convey complex ideas and information clearly and accurately through the effective selection, organization, and analysis of content. And 3, write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, well-chosen details, and well-structured event sequences. So when you look at those 3 standards, what are some of the words that kind of pop out to you, and what are you thinking about when you see those words?
Well, when I see the word substantive in number 1, it tells me that this is going to be some topics that are more relevant to the kids than probably what we normally do. So it's going to mean something to them.
Yeah, I think that word is really interesting too, and that it makes me think that we are going to have to open up some conversations about what it means for something to be substantive, for example, and how do we decide a term that's maybe not so or objective, what does that mean for us, and what kinds of topics really are relevant for kids. Great.
One of the things that I'm seeing is, I'm a mathematics teacher, and some of the words that really stand out to me are arguments, supporting claims, texts, explanatory, explanations, and writing those explanations clearly. One of the things that my kids struggle with is explaining why they got answers, or you ask them to explain their process or explain why they're getting things, and they really struggle with that. So it's good to see that if I implement some of this writing in my classroom, I'll also be supporting the writing standards for the anchor as well as the mathematical practice standards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that those 3 types of writing are grouped together but in separate standards, and I'm wondering what that suggests about how we should teach them, and what the relationship might be among those. And then I'm really interested in informative explanatory text, because we for so long have used the word expository text, but I think maybe that's kind of a language arts type of word, and this is maybe a little bit more clear.
Yeah, I like explanatory better.
When also it goes back, like the reading standards, to history, social studies, and technical subjects. So I can see lots of teachers being able to easily bring in the writing standards to their classrooms.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next category, production and distribution of writing. All right, so now that we have finished the writing standards all together, the next step is for you to do together. So we're going to have everybody in your small groups, just at your tables, just repeat this same process for the speaking and listening standards. So you'll be discussing each one, read each one, and talk about what you're thinking and feeling. And then usually the last step would be to have students do one section on their own, but for the sake of discussion, after you finish the speaking and listening standards, you can either move on to the language standards or the standards for mathematical practice and discuss those, depending on which you feel is most relevant to your content area.